Good evening and welcome to Books and Books. Some of you, I'm sure, are here for the first time. Some of you, I'm sure, are longtime loyal patrons and friends of the store. It's my distinct and unique pleasure to be able to stand up here and introduce a personal hero of mine as far as my own personal philosophy and view of the world, but also as an educator. A Long Way Gone was published the year that I began teaching international relations in a high school. And one of my students in class walked in one day with this hardcover, book, and he said, "You've got to read this, and we have to read it in class." And I said, "Okay." And for the last, 7 years, it's been in our canon. And it's the one book that my students read and changes their lives. And Ishmael's voice belongs to, it's a voice that belongs to a natural born writer. And year after year, my students say that it changes their lives because they're drawn into his world and they're captured by it. And in spite of all the struggle and in spite of all the turmoil and all the suffering, at the end, we realize, our students realize, the reader realizes that anyone can pull through out of anything, and that anyone can be rehabilitated and saved. And in fact, they end up learning what the true meaning of, if you've read the book, of one love and what that means. And his memoir illustrates that redemption is always possible in spite of how torturous the process might be. And in his new book, Ishmael has decided to use fiction as his new medium, and the results are no less powerful. A thoroughly contemporary story of a practice that is all too common in this world. Ishmael uses the power of language, especially the power of mende, to once again show the reader that humans have the extraordinary capability, yes, to destroy, but more importantly, to heal themselves and to heal others along the way. A UNICEF ambassador, an advocate for children affected by war, a member of Human Rights Watch, the founder and president of foundations to help children affected by conflict. I mean, I could take up all of his time just reading his list of accomplishments, but I think that it would do us all a lot of good if we just give him a big welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. What I'm going to do is perhaps start before I speak about this novel. Just talk a little bit about my emergence as a writer, really, and a little bit about the first book, because I think it would illustrate some of the reasons why I choose to write. I am one person who follows sort of in the footsteps of the tradition of the words of Albert Camus, who said that, to paraphrase a little bit, that the role of a writer is not to represent those who make history, but rather those who suffer history. So I actually write coming from that angle, being that I am from a place that was very little known about until really we had a civil war. And at the height of that bloodshed is when we began to be known in the world. And for a lot of people, their imagination is filled with that only. Sierra Leone equals civil war, amputation, madness, war, with no context whatsoever. And so my initial sort of rise to the writing world really came out of that frustration. I wanted to change people's view, to give a necessary human context to some of the things that were occurring in my country, so they can understand it, to see that there was a Sierra Leone before the war, during the war, and after the war. That Sierra Leone during the war is not the entirety of its history, and that's not even how you would understand the country. But let's go back into the beginning. I grew up in a very remote part of the country, Sierra Leone in West Africa. In the southern part of the country, I grew up in a village. I did not have electricity or tap water, but yet I went to school. Sierra Leone being a former British colony, we had a very strong sort of model of British education. So I remember at a very young age, I knew friends, Roman countrymen, lend me your ears have come to bury Caesar from Shakespeare without even knowing what it meant initially. Then later I learned what that meant. Also, as a young boy, I wrote letters in my community for those who were not literate. And this was really my early training without even knowing it for writing. I remember one instance, a woman, a mother, had come to me to write a letter to her son who was in the capital city. And she really missed him and wanted him to return. So she started by saying to me, please tell my son, the one who I was pregnant with for 9 months, the one who I went into labor with for X number of hours, the one who, when he was born, he cried day and night, I couldn't sleep for months. The one when he first shat in his pants, I took him to the river to wash him off. Please, tell him that to come home, his mother misses him. So I was sitting there thinking to myself, okay, sometimes you have to get to the point, in writing. And I just say, you must come home now. Your mother really misses you, So at a young age, I realized, even though this language is beautiful and everything, when you describe it, sometimes you have to succinctly say what you need to say in a few words so that the narrative can move on. As a young boy, I also sat around the fire and listened to stories. And where I'm coming from in my tradition and what you will see in this novel, we believe that story is medicine. It's medicine that is put in you, infused in you when you're younger or even when you're older to prepare you for what may come later so that it can strengthen your spirit and your resolve and your character for anything that may happen to you later in your life. So when I was a kid, we'll sit around the fire and the elders will tell stories and they'll tell you, you will know when this story is relevant to you. Of course, we were just children. Sometimes we did not really know what that meant until later on in our lives. But through this telling of this story, there are ways that things are rendered that are very important, that these explanations will make sense later. There were techniques, because the oral tradition commands you to grab your imagination and bring you to a world and keep you there until it release you. Because you don't have to go back to, you really have to bring people by painting images so that they can smell, feel, hear, and be part of the narrative so intimately that they cannot go anywhere at all. And so when they were telling us a story, there were techniques that were used to make sure that you actually were listening. They will retell a story that everybody knew, they've heard hundreds and thousands of times. And through the telling of that story, they will add things that were not part of it. Now, if no one in the audience protested, they knew nobody was listening. So they wouldn't tell you the new story because it meant you were not ready and prepared to receive it. So, and also when you're telling the story, there are certain sounds that you make that mean a lot of things. So when I'm writing, I also try to bring some of these sounds, find a way so the reader can feel them. Because I'm a writer who feels that language has to fit landscape. If I were talking to, I was describing elders or adults talking to children, they would not say you guys on an African landscape. They would say children, you boys, or you girls. They would not say you guys. If that was there, it would be somewhere else, So I'm very aware of these things when I'm writing. So when I was a kid, when they're telling a story, they would say the following thing. He ran, tuk, 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 tuk. She ran, kuju, 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 kuju. These are two different meanings. She ran, tuk, 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 means the person was running during the day. She ran, kuju, 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 means it's at night. I would explain. During the daytime, there are other sounds that are occurring. So when you run, your footsteps are not as heavy and you cannot hear them because birds may be singing, a car may go by, a blacksmith may be ironing something, so you cannot. But at night, when other sounds have quieted, your footsteps are heavier, so you can actually hear them. To bring the reference closer to you guys, if you've ever lived below somebody at night when they walk up and down the apartment, I think you can hear them more than during the day because everything is quiet and your mind is actually at rest. So when they're telling a story, they will not say it was nighttime that the person ran. They would just make that sound and you would know. So all these techniques, when I'm writing, I try to bring it. So for my first memoir, when I was writing this, it really came out of the frustration of the way people were speaking about my country, Sierra Leone, when it began to appear in the news. People were saying Sierra Leone equals amputation, madness, war. So people's first encounter to Sierra Leone came through that medium. And also when they started speaking about former child soldiers, somebody like myself who had come out of that experience, they referred to us as the lost generation, people who could not be repaired. We were finished. We were damaged goods. And so I started writing to prepare myself to do a debate. If I ever were to speak to somebody to succinctly present a point to say this is not true, here's the context, and here are the things. So I never intended to publish the first book, actually. So I wrote it. But when I was writing, I realized the only way anybody is going to understand it if I go back and think at 12 years old, when I was running from the war, how I felt, the feelings. So this required me to go back into those memories that were very, very, very difficult. But I did my best so that people can feel the exhaustion that I felt running on the path or being afraid for my life constantly. Equally, I wanted people to understand the strength of the human spirit to recover after all of this. It is difficult, but it is possible. And all of that I was able to, with the help of a lot of other people, I've seen the worst of human beings, but I was also able to see the best of them. So I came from this, from deep down to kind of rise to the other side, with the help of human beings as well. So I wanted people to see that. Now, when that book came out, I was traveling for it, going around constantly, talking about it. I began to observe other things. One of them was this, that there was so much interest in learning about when a war is going on in a place, when a bloodshed is unfolding. People wanted to pay attention to that. That was in the news. But as soon as bloodshed ended or the guns silenced in any country, the news, even sometimes organizations, international organizations, turned to the next bloodshed. It became the next hotspot. Nobody wanted to pay attention to what happens when the guns silence, when wars end, and people return to their homes. Is it possible that they could go back to the lives that they've had before? If they cannot, what forms do they embrace? What parts of their traditions do they repair? And what does that say about them as human beings, about their humanity? Now, when a war unfolds, everybody scatters and they go into different parts of the country. Some even become refugees in other countries. So when they return, they also come with ideas about how they want their lives to be. Can they do that in the environment that they've run away from? How do you move towards the future when the past is still trying to pull at you? How do you preserve what means the most to you in this uncertain time of your life? And also when people return, you have to start by cleaning. So in this narrative, when it opens in Radiance of Tomorrow, you meet characters that are returning back to a town called Imperi and try to find ways to begin living there again and the difficulties that come with that. Of course, the older people begin to come back first because that it must be the case. The elders are the first to rekindle their broken friendship with the land after any kind of devastation. So they come and they begin to clean the bones. Now, during a war, when people are gone down, nobody's going about and burying them. So when you return, you even have to clean those bones. People don't even think about that. And then you have to even go into the houses and cut the grasses and the trees that have grown in the houses because there was no human presence, so they grow there. When you live in a town, grasses don't grow inside houses when human beings inhabit them. Your spirit kind of drives them away, but if you're not there, they will grow. So when you go to get rid of them, how do you do all of these things? Also, a lot of things have changed. The way you used to relate to each other are no longer the same. When you see somebody, if you haven't seen them for many years during the war, you did not greet them the way you did before the war. Before the war, you would say to them, elaborate greetings. You would say, how are you? How is your child? How is your grandson? How is your mother? How is your grandmother? And they will give you detailed description about all members of their families. And in return, they would ask you the same. Now, after the war, you could not do that because you did not know who someone had lost. So by asking them that question, you actually opened that wound that they may have been trying to heal. So there was that hesitation that was in the air when these characters returned to Imperi. Now, when you also, some things have changed also. For example, a boy with a machete before the war is just a boy going to harvest a crop, or maybe going to the farm to brush something. Now, when you saw a boy with a young man with a machete after the war, there was another connotation added to it. They could be coming to do something else with it. How do you stop flinching? when you see it? How do you change all of these things? So in this narrative, characters come. So they are the elders. They are former child soldiers who returned. They are amputees who returned. A man amputated Silla with his 2 children who had been amputated during the war. There's a young woman who returns, who comes with a child that she had given birth to during the war through measures that were not nice. So she doesn't like looking at the child. And she brings the child back into that community. You have a man who returns with his family, Bakari, who tries to keep his family together, and another teacher who comes back, and various other characters who come back into this town, and they begin to try and live there again. And slowly they begin to put back things together, and they begin to function. But in order for me to achieve this, I also had to go back not only to the oral tradition, but to the language itself of the place. Because in Sierra Leone, we have lots of languages. We have 15 languages and 3 dialects. I grew up speaking about 7 of them. My mother tongue, which is Mende, the language that I spoke first, and others in Sierra Leone, is very figurative. So I try to think in that language and find the English equivalent of some of the things that I want to say. Sometimes it's not an easy task, but if I can find the equivalent, I will find a way to describe the feeling so the reader can feel it. I'll give you some examples. In Mende, how you say night came suddenly, excuse me, you say the sky rolled over and changed its sides. So if I were to say the sky rolled over and changed its sides, you see the sudden arrival of night. How you say somebody's thoughts are scattered, you say your mind was like an anthill filled with smoke. Because if you think about it, you take a firewood and you put it in an anthill, you see the ants going in different directions. So that really gives you the physical description of these things. If you describe objects like a ball, we call it fefete, which translates to a nest of air or a vessel that carries air. So if I were to say the children kicked around a ball, that's one form of using the English language. But if I were to say children kicked around a nest of air or a vessel that carries air, you all of a sudden know that you are in a different landscape where this language is spoken in that way. And also when the elders speak, they speak in parables. They speak in ways that are very beautiful so that you can draw meaning from it. And I try to bring all of that in this narrative. So when you read this book, you will see that feeling of this place that I'm describing. And so you see the way sentences are rendered. It's not the most conventional ways you've seen an English speaker would write some of these things. So anyway, I wanted to do that deliberately so that you can feel where you are at all times during the narrative itself. Now, when you're in the capital city, the language changes. Because even though you know all these languages, when you're in the capital city, the way you speak any of these languages is filled with more English words because you're not deep in the countryside. Now, if you're in the Freetown, the capital city of Sierra Leone, for example, you would say bicycle when you talk in Mende. You say, here is a bicycle. But actually, in the deeper countryside, when you speak, there's no word for bicycle because it's not something that was part of our tradition, our culture. It was something that came from the outside. So the only word we have for it is the sound that the bicycle makes. And we have these old models, Phoenix bike models, and the bells goes giriginje, giriginje. So when you talk about bicycle, you call it giriginje, which is the sound that it makes. So all of these things are part of my background, part of who I am, part of what makes me in this tradition that I try to bring in the way that I write. Now, with that said, what I'm going to do is perhaps to read just a little bit from this narrative so that you can see some of these things that I've been describing, and also to introduce you to a few characters. I'm going to start from chapter 1, but then I'm going to skip around a little bit here and there. It is the end, or maybe the beginning of another story. Every story begins and ends with a woman, a mother, a grandmother, a girl, a child. Every story is a birth. She was the first to arrive where it seemed the wind no longer exhaled. Several miles from town, the trees had entangled one another. Their branches grew toward the ground, burying the leaves in the soil to blind their eyes so the sun would not promise them tomorrow with its rays. It was only the path that was reluctant to cloak its surface completely with grasses, as though it anticipated it would soon end its starvation for the warmth of bare feet that gave it life. Evening was approaching, and the sky was preparing to roll over and change its side. She sat on the ground, allowing the night breeze to soothe her face and her pain, to dry her tears. When she was a child, her grandmother told her that at the quietest hours of night, God and gods would wave their hands through the breeze to wipe just a few things off the face of the earth, so that it would be able to accommodate the following day. Though her pain didn't completely disappear with the arrival of morning, she felt some new strength within her heart that gave her the idea to pluck herself from the earth and begin cleaning the bones. She started at her house with a pile in her hands that shivered, maybe because of the cool morning air or the emotions that came from gathering what remained of others. She rounded the corner and dropped the pile, her heart sinking to her waistbone at the resounding thud of the bones hitting the dusty earth. Her feet gave way under her body as she saw the back of a man sitting on his knees, tying bones together as one would a bundle of kindling. She could tell that this was an old man, as his hair was the color of stagnant clouds. The man's movement expressed his age. This brought her heart back to its proper place, allowing the rest of her body to resume its many functions. The old man, sensing a shadow behind him, spoke. "If you are a spirit, please pass by peacefully. I am doing this work to make sure that when people return to this town, they may not see this. I know their eyes have recorded worse, but still, I will spare them one last image of despair. I will help you then." She lowered herself and began picking up the bones she had dropped and some more, making her way toward him. "I know that voice. Is that you, Kadi?" He trembled, his hands unable to do what they had been doing since he had arrived, as the sky was wiping the last residues of sleep from its surface. Kadi answered quietly, as though afraid to disturb the silence that had come about just at that moment. His heart hesitated to give permission to his face to turn around and greet his friend. He sat for some time watching his shadow move, and all the while he could hear Kadi rattling the bones and sighing as she continued her work. Turning to see her would give his heart the burden of coming to terms with whatever condition she was in. She might be amputated, deformed in some way or another. He sat some more in his torment, and Kadi decided to end his hesitation, as she knew why he had hidden his eyes from his words. She came before him and sat on the ground. His eyes had dug themselves deep into the earth. "Please remove your eyes from the body of the earth and see your friend. I am sure your heart will perform a joyful dance when you see that I am as well as I can be." She placed her right hand on his shoulder. He held onto her hand, and slowly, like a child caught making mischief, he lifted his head. His eyes surveyed the body of his friend, while his mind confirmed. Her hands are both there. Her legs too. Nose, ears, lips. "I am here, Moira. All of how I came into this world is here." Her voice stopped his mind's roll call on her body parts. Thank you. That gave me a chance to drink a little bit. What I'm trying to get at here is also the burden of even seeing somebody after the war. When you heard the voice, you did not want to turn around to see them because you didn't know what condition they would be in. And by turning around, you took on that burden yourself because you would have to learn to adjust to that. In this narrative, you also see children who are born towards the end of the war. So they have no recollection really of what the war had been. And they had been told stories about this place, this nostalgia about home. So they come with different thinking about where they are going. And some of them, when they see the other children who had seen only war, amputated, they don't understand why a child their age doesn't have both hands. And they try to understand, but they don't know which questions to ask. Also, the adults don't want to discuss certain things because they don't have the words and they don't want to bring up certain things. So you witness all these difficulties in the community. Also, the idea of power had changed during the war, where young people had a real sense of power because they had weapons in their hands and they could go around and decide who lived or died. And after the war, they have to come back and be under the tutelage of the elders. How do they start to do that? And one thing through this narrative that I also see is not only the story as medicine, but also how you pass on stories to the next generation. Because stories are only worth anything if they are passed on from one generation to another. Otherwise, they die, and the wisdom and the tradition dies along with them. So there's a struggle for the elders to begin to pour that knowledge into the new generation so that it can continue to live on. And so you see all of this push and pull. Lastly, one thing I would say on this book is this. Throughout these characters, you're going to learn one important thing that I hope everybody will catch through the narrative in various ways, which is this, that happiness is not a sort of continuum. It's not a continuous thing. You can't be happy for 2 years, 5 years in a row. Happiness is moments. There are moments of it. So what these characters are trying to show you is that happiness is not the absence of any challenge in one's life. It's with those challenges, the ability to be happy, to find time to love each other genuinely, to create families, and to live fully with the backdrop of everything that life brings us on a daily basis. So when you see these characters, you begin to understand that, the vibrancy of these people and how they continue to thrive no matter what happens to them. So with that said, I'm going to go back to actually my early initiation to writing in this country. When I had left Sierra Leone, and the woman who took me into her life had worked very hard to bring me, Laura Sims, to bring me to New York. There were a series of things that were occurring. One, when I would go to any embassy, people would ask me, do you have a bank statement or a document that showed ownership of property before we can give you a visa that determines that you could return to your country, Sierra Leone? And I remember saying to one of the people interviewing me at the embassy that, have you ever been in a war? And they said, no, but do you have those documents? I remember thinking to myself, let's assume that I had this documentation. Do you really think that when people were shooting at you and gunning people down, you're going to think to yourself, you know, I should find my bank account and take it with me? And also, I was coming from a different culture where the measure of what ownership is was not through a piece of paper. Everybody knew this was my grandfather's land, and that was enough. There was no paper to prove that. Everybody knew, and it was passed down from one generation to another. So all of a sudden, I'm being asked to provide these things. When I arrived in the United States, a similar thing occurred. When my mom took me around to get into schools, people asked me, do you have a report card? And I remember saying, no, I don't have a report card. And I remember the response was, everybody has a report card. And I was thinking to myself, I know a lot of people who don't have report cards. You know, because again, we weren't running from the war thinking, oh, you know, we should take our report cards just in case we need them. We didn't even think we could live to see the next moment, you know. So all of these things began to really tell me that people do not really know what violence is. Maybe they have an idea of it. Maybe they have some fascination about it even, but they don't really know truly what it does to people, how it dehumanizes people, how it destroys everything that you know. So my first essay that I ever wrote in the United States was called Why I Don't Have a Report Card. And this is what got me into school, because everybody kept asking me, okay, I have to explain so that they would stop asking me. And then this essay explained certain things to some people, and then they were able to take me into a school. Much to my surprise, they placed me in 11th grade. I hadn't been in school for quite some time, and it was very surprising to me that they placed me in 11th grade. And I struggled a little bit because also I was coming from a place where I didn't have the same mediums that people who have been doing in school. For example, I wrote an essay by hand when I was in school, a pen and a paper, and I would handwrite it very legibly. So when I came in, I would handwrite an essay and I gave it to the teacher. He said, oh, you need to type it. I was like, what does that mean? You know, and then they gave me a little computer. It took literally a week to type the thing, one finger at a time. I didn't know how to do it. But I thrived. But the point that I'm trying to make is that this is really when I began to look at writing as this. For me, writing had become a way to bring to life some of the things that I cannot provide physically. Writing had become a way to let people understand that had existed before they met me and what that existence felt like. the beauty of it, the difficulties of it, the challenges of it, and what my dreams were, so people can come into my world that I cannot show them proof of. I remember when I was also in high school, last year of high school, everybody was asked to bring a baby picture. I was the only one who could not provide one. And all my friends who did not know my background at that time, their only conclusion was that, you know, I must have been a really ugly baby. That's why I'd refused to bring. And I found the explanation very funny, and I just agreed with it because I didn't want to explain who I was. At this point, I hadn't written the memoir yet. So I just laughed. So what I had to do was to write a small poem about how I was a baby, what I may have looked like as a baby. You know, so for me, writing had taken that. It's that important to me. To bring to life some of the things I cannot provide physically. So I do hope throughout my talk I was able to transport you a little bit to this part of my own world, of my own culture, and the wisdom and traditions of my own people. And I do hope that if you read Radiance of Tomorrow, you will discover more of that. With that said, I thank you for your time and your attention so far. I will take some questions from you. Please raise your hands and ask any questions you would like, and I will do my best. There's an eager person waiting for one. Okay, so we'll start. Yes, young man.
Good evening.
Good evening. You came prepared.
Nice. My name is Jamal Smith. I came from Miami North High School. Thank you. I'd like to ask your opinion on recent gun violence in the U.S., such as Sandy Hook. Do you think guns should be reserved for law enforcement, or should everyone have them?
So the question, I'll repeat it for the benefit of everybody, is that based on recent gun violence in schools around the United States, what are my opinions on whether guns should be reserved for only law enforcement people or everybody should have it? Well, I'll tell you one thing. I'll give you something that would answer the question. In my capacity as a UNICEF ambassador and advocate for children affected by war, I find myself going into a lot of places where there's an all-out civil war, you know, where people actually have weapons and they're gunning each other and they're fighting, right? And there are people who have been able to come out of that violence and they're living nearby where they can hear the gunshots. And I was able to have a conversation with some of the people, and the young people particularly who live there, whether they would want weapons. And they said, absolutely not. These are people who live very close to violence. And they say they don't want weapons because it only exacerbates the situation. So, in a way, this is my answer to your question. I think when people don't understand what violence really is, sometimes they will glorify it, or sometimes they have a fascination with it. If you've been touched by violence deeply, you know there is nothing, absolutely nothing fascinating about it. Anybody who glorifies it doesn't know what it is. The bravado is just people pretending they really understand what it is. Most of the hip-hop artists, we made a documentary a few years back. We took some hip-hop artists from Wu-Tang and other people to Sierra Leone. And these are some of the guys who will rap about having this weapon and that weapon. Most of them don't even live in the neighborhoods they rap about. You know, they live elsewhere where it's nice and everything, right? And so they talk about having these weapons. But we took them to Sierra Leone, and some of them were scared. And the war wasn't even going on anymore, you know. So just to give you a sense, I think young people should understand the difference between virtual violence and this idea of violence and the reality of it. When you play a video game, you shoot somebody, you can restart. In real life, when you do, you live with the consequence. You cannot. And so with these things, I hope people will make the right decisions about however it is they want to protect themselves. Yes. Yes.
Hello. Hello. My name is Robert Mitchell from Miami North Senior High. I wanted to know, what were your dreams after the war?
What were my dreams after the war? The question is, after the war, I actually did not have many dreams right after the war. It was much later. Because when I was in the war, I had been conditioned to a certain way of functioning, which is that I knew how to survive, but not how to live. It's a big difference. I knew how to live day by day, minute by minute, short-term thinking, because that's all I'd come to know during the war. You cannot plan too much ahead. Can I survive the next minute? If it's possible, I survive the next minute. That's how I knew how to live. So actually, when I came here, or everywhere that I was, that had a little bit of peace in my life, one of the most tormenting questions that people asked me was, what are you going to do with your life in 4 years? And I would think in my head, well, maybe we'll see if tomorrow is possible, then we can answer that question. Because that's how I could function. So I really could not think anything else was possible. But later, after that, I began to think, actually, I studied political science. I wanted to understand what happened in my country from the international perspective and the national perspective as well. And I was interested in going to law school and various other things. I never actually had the ambition to be a writer. But later on, I began to write, and people recognized some of the things that I was writing. One of the first stories that I ever published is called At Noon. And I was at university at Oberlin College in Ohio. And an opportunity came school-wide to write a short story, a fictional piece, to win about $2,000 to $3,000. I had scholarship, but I had no money, no pocket money at all. You know, I was actually washing dishes for the school in the back and everything to make a little bit of money. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm going to try to see whether I can get that money. And so I sat down and wrote a story in a space of a few hours that was called At Noon. It was fictional, but it was based on one particular incident that occurred when I was in Freetown, the capital city of my country, which is that in the afternoon, at noon, there will be this fighter plane that would come, and it will bombard the strongholds of some of the fighting groups. And it was during this time that if you had food as a civilian, at this time I wasn't in the war anymore, so I was a civilian, that if you had any food, you will come out around that time and cook it so that you can actually eat it, and cook it very quickly, because the guys with the guns were hiding when this bombing was occurring. If you cooked it in any other time, they will come with their guns and put you on the gunpoint and eat your food. So when they were running and hiding, that's when you came out to cook. So I wrote a fictional piece around that particular event. And then it won the thing in school. So when this happened, I won the money. I sent the money home to my cousins. And then I was able to go to the Chinese restaurant and buy like a plate that was maybe $1 or $2 more expensive. You know, I was very happy about it. And so then some of the professors in the school began to say, you know, you have a talent. If you're interested in writing, we can work with you. And so this is really how I began to even write seriously. Prior to that, I only wrote essays and things like that, and try to find ways to write a few things just to make a point here and there. But anyway, so that's how it started. And then later on, I began to have dreams because I knew that it was possible. I had learned how to live, no longer to just survive. Yeah? Okay. Yes.
I'm Alia El-Gayar. I'm from Gulliver Academy. And my question is, what advice could you give to someone who had been through similar situations as you, yet was not able to reach the same redemption you?
The question is, what advice can I give to somebody who had gone through a similar thing that I did, but yet haven't been able to reach the same redemption that I've been able to? Well, first of all, I always say that what works for me does not necessarily work for somebody else. When it comes to recovering from trauma and difficulty, everybody has their own path that they have to walk. I have some friends of mine, their own way of recovery was to never speak about the war again, not even in a joking way. They never want to hear about it again, and for them, it's their recovery. And it worked for them. For some people, it was doing other things. For example, there are some former child soldiers who are boxers. One is named Kasim, the Dream. He took boxing as his career. And a lot of people will say, wow, well, that's kind of weird. But to him, it brings him something, and that works for him. There are some that do music. Emmanuel Jal became a musician, and he raps and writes songs about what had happened, and others just keep quiet. But what I have to say, you have to find your own path. But here is the thing. My advice I will give to you is this, to whoever is struggling. First of all, it's not easy to recover. I didn't just come out of a way and 2 days later I was doing it. It took me many, many years to even be able to smile or to even learn how to sleep. You know, it didn't just happen. So it takes a lot of time. Secondly, never ever think, that's what I did for many years, that you're going to get rid of all the memories of that life out of your head and clean it. You can't. When you do that, you would just torture yourself some more. It's not possible to forget. What is possible is to learn to live with them and to learn to refocus some of the energies that come from that, actually. I would explain. When I came out of the war, I had a lot of insomnia. I couldn't sleep. For many years, people say, oh, you should see a doctor, this and that, but I refused. Because guess what? When I was in university, insomnia was fantastic for me. All my peers could fall asleep. They couldn't finish their homework. I would do my homework, do extra readings. I would go party, and then I'll come back. I still wasn't sleeping. So I thought, this is great. So I worked really hard. And so it became a positive thing for me to use. Being in the army, I learned discipline. To be able to sit somewhere and guard a post with your life and not move. I used that same discipline to sit somewhere and read a book until I finished it without moving. I refocused it. You understand? And also, I started to strive to build newer memories that then will compete with the war memories themselves. So when I think of certain things, I equally have other memories of good things in my life as well. And I really went after doing that. I'll give you one last example. When I came here to the US, I made some friends who lived in California. And I went to visit them. And they said we were going to go hiking. And I thought to myself, absolutely not. There's no way I can voluntarily go in the bush just for the pleasure of it. That's ridiculous. Because for me, where I was coming from, I went into the bush because I was running for my life. So looking into the bush was not a pleasurable thing for me. And then we went walking, and they said, oh, yeah, we're going to sleep. I was like, absolutely not. I'm not sleeping in the bush. So I walked back. They were like, oh, yeah, and they came back with me. So I was like, I'm not doing it. Because for me, it brought back so many things. But over the years, I pushed myself slowly, and I'm able to enjoy just nature itself again, So when I think of nature, I also have memories of the world, but I have more memories of actually doing fun things in nature. You understand? So those would be my advice. It is not easy, but you can work at it. And one last thing I would say is that the fact that you already survived these experiences and you're still alive means that you have a strength in you. You've already done the most difficult part of it. The other ones are, but you've already, and to survive requires remarkable intelligence. You just need to tap into that intelligence a little bit more to live, right? And one day at a time, Okay. Yeah. Yes.
I like to ask you, do you think Alhaji is still alive, and what would you say to him?
If I think Alhaji is still alive, and what would I say to him? Well, I don't think he's alive because I tried to look for him so many times. I was able to find other people. But if he's still alive, I guess the only thing that I would say to him, find a way to get in touch with me. Well, because, he was, some of these guys that I fought with, the ones that survived, became my family, because we've seen the worst part of each other and the best part of each other as well. So when I shake hands with some of these guys, there's so much in that handshake that I would never be able to share with so many people, It's just certain feelings to understand each other in that way. So I do hope he's alive, and if he's not, I do hope he's at peace wherever he is, So, yes. Any other question? You had one? Yes.
My name is Luis Martinez. I'm from Gulliver Academy. I'd like to know if you still think about Esther, as she is one of the people that helped you with your redemption.
The question is if I still think about Esther. Esther is the nurse in the memoir that actually was one of the first people that I began to trust after coming out of this experience. I actually was able to find Esther because of the book. For many years, I tried to look for her, and it was not possible. So when A Long Way Gone came out, and I was in Canada giving a talk, and somebody came to me and said, I know where Esther lives in Canada, and gave me her number. And I was able to get in touch with her and called her, and actually went and saw her a number of times in Canada. When I was there to do some work, I would see her, and I kept in touch with her. But it was really very interesting because it was because of what I wrote, that some of the people that I thought I had lost were coming back to life. So sometimes it was really quite amazing when I would be reading and then somebody from the narrative was in the audience. I remember in Boston, Mr. Kamara, one of the people who was in charge of the rehabilitation center, he lives in Boston now with his family. So I was in Boston giving a reading, and he was in the audience. And at first I thought maybe I was having those flashbacks because I kept looking at this fellow and thinking, yeah, I know that fellow. But that can't be possible, you know. And then I finally stopped and said, is that you? And he said, oh, yeah, it's me. And of course, all the media went to talk to him, and I got a chance to relax a little bit, you know. And so it was quite nice, you know. So there are instances where people come alive. But Esther is doing well. She's married. I think she has one child now. And so she's doing very well. She's still practicing nursing in Canada, actually. So she's doing well. Yes.
How you doing? Francis Mijares from LaSalle. I'm a student of Mr. Moya's in the front row. I always, my tragedy or suffering doesn't compare at all to yours, but I lost my parents very early on, and I have the similar story to other students in my school. And I seem to take it in a different way as far as me being able to recover. And you spoke about the trials of rehabilitation and you know, coming from that and moving forward with your life. I feel I've been able to do that only because of my aunt and my uncle who were able to take me in. And I looked you up before coming, and Lauren Sims, I think you mentioned her,
Yes.
how she took you and she became your mother. You went to high school in New York and then college later on.
Mm-hmm.
How influential was she as far as your rehabilitation, and how far you've been able to come? Because for me at least, like my aunt was, without her, you know, I don't think, and without Lauren, I don't think you and I would be able to be here, you know? We'd have a much different perspective. So how influential do you think those key people are? And this is what I'm asking.
Well, the question that this young man is asking is that how influential are people who come into your life after you've lost those dear to you in terms of furthering for you to get hold of your life again? Absolutely, it's part of it. I had said earlier that there are several things. Having stability and rebelieving in the power of love and family life again actually presents you that foundation that you need to be able to leap forward to do anything. When I came out of the war, first it was my uncle that I lived in the capital city, that I began to rely on other human beings again for any kind of help, because before that I didn't rely on anybody at all. And then, of course, my mom here, Laura Sims, who took me into her life at a time when most people were afraid of somebody like me to even keep me in their house, you know. I remember when I was with my mom, sometimes her friends would call her to check on her to see if she had hidden the knives, because they only expected violence from me, you know. But she saw me only as this child who needed a mother. And that changed a lot of things for me. So that made me begin to believe in the fact that people can actually love each other genuinely without having an agenda, because that's what I'd come to know, right? So that changed a lot for me. In addition to having the family stability, another thing for me that I would say is also equally as important is having an opportunity in your life to do something with yourself, because then you discover what you are capable of as a human being, your intelligence and all of these things. So being able to go to school, I learned things about myself that I didn't know. Because during the war, all I knew was that I was capable of fighting and bringing violence. So these things really helped to push me forward again. But absolutely, family is essential and crucial in the recovery. Actually, a lot of young people who come out of war, generally speaking, the ones that it takes a much longer time to recover are the ones who never had any sense of family structure before the violence consumed their lives. So they have no sort of threshold, any place to go to start from. Some of us had, even though it was short-lived, we had a sense of what it meant to be loved, to be part of a family. So you have something in you, and you know what it is. There are some children who were born during the war. They've never experienced anything like that. For them, you have to build that before they can even begin to recover. So it's more difficult. So definitely essential to have that.
Folks, we have time for 2 more questions. And if you don't get your question in, perhaps you can ask Ishmael when he's signing your book. But for right now, just 2 more questions, please.
Okay, we'll go all the way in the back there. Yes.
Hi, I'm one of Mr. Moya's students too. And my question is, what is your approach to African stereotypes, and how do you challenge those in your writing?
This is a very interesting question. The question is, what are my approaches to African stereotypes, and how do I challenge that in my writing? Well, what I try to show is to introduce people to sort of the African context, which is in itself, it's so complex. There's so many. For example, in Sierra Leone, there's so many things. Going from one city to another, you change landscape, people, their mannerisms, you know. So I try, first of all, to take away the generalization, you know, to have people understand that this continent is big. It has a lot of complex histories and things like that. It's not just one thing, right? It's try to change that. So in my narrative, I introduce people to actually the wisdom that is on this landscape, the strength, the traditions that people have so they can see it, you know. And that's how I try to challenge it in a way. Now, in my own personal life, there are other ways I challenge it when people ask me certain questions about who I am. I'll be very honest with you. There are instances where if you say to somebody you are from some African country, automatically they think you cannot speak English or French or some other language, you know. They just assume. And all of this comes because of how we've been portrayed over the years, you know, the very limited way that people speak about us, you know, to the point that, you know, when you come to any country, not just the United States, to the West, people think that you used to sleep in the bush or you sleep in trees, and then you realize to them, I only went to sleep in the bush because there was a war. Prior to that, I never went in the bush for any, only to farm or do something. You know, so you begin to change that stereotype. You begin to introduce people to see that there's actually a vibrancy that's going on the African continent. I'll give you one more contemporary example. This whole, when this Coney 2012 thing unfolded, right? 2013, I don't know what year even was. 2012, yeah? All right. This was a clear indication for people to understand that you cannot generalize the African landscape anymore. Because guess what? People also have phones on the African continent, and they're on Twitter, on Facebook. So if you say something about them that's not correct, guess what? They will respond. It's not like back in the day when maybe you would say anything and get it, because we are very active nowadays. So this just goes to show you that it is not, it's different, of course. Traditions are different, but that doesn't mean that it's backwards. Right? Different doesn't mean backwards. It's just a different way of people wanting to live their lives. So I think that those are some of the things. I've been places where I will speak to people and I've just signed their books and they will say to me, wow, so you speak English. When did you learn it? You know? So, but who knows? That's what it is. But anyway, one last question. Let's see. I cannot see. Yes, young.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Talia. I come from Northern High. I have a question. Do you think you could ever tell your children this story?
The question is if I think I can ever tell my children this story. Yes, absolutely. Now I will have to wait for a certain age, you know, for me to tell them. But I will want to explain to them myself, for them to understand, to hear from me before they even read anything that I've written. Because there are probably certain aspects of the story that I would never share with the world, but I could share with my child, for them to understand. But also the way I raise my child will be very clear to them about what the things that I don't tolerate, particularly violence. I think sometimes when we talk about violence, we only think about the physical aspect of it. But there's also the psychological aspect of it. There's also the verbal violence. And all of these things are what culminate to actually the physical violence itself. So the way I'll raise my children is for them to understand I have no tolerance for any of it whatsoever. And the way I conduct myself will be that example that they will see as they learn about their father and their father's background. So I would do my best, I guess, is all I can say. With that said, thank you very much. And I will sign some books.
Take you to the other side. All right, folks, before you get up, if I could please have your attention, I have a couple of important announcements to make. One is we have the Radiance of Tomorrow as well as A Long Way Gone for sale at both the east side counter and the west side counter at the other side of the store. Ishmael is going to be signing books on the west side of the store, not in this room. The line can form that way. But one more thing I have to ask you, since this room is so full, is as you get up, if you could fold the chair and stack it against the wall, it'll be much more efficient for you to be able to get to the counter to buy your books and get into the signing line if you folded the chairs and stacked them against the wall. And that was inspirational. If you could please give Ishmael a hand. Thanks very much.